Senator from New Hampshire.
I rise today to join my colleagues in speaking out against what I believe is the misleading and dangerous campaign of some in the fossil fuel industry to undermine this nation's efforts to combat global climate change. The science on climate change is beyond rational dispute. Climate change is real. It's a clear and present threat to our planet, and it must be addressed robustly and urgently. Scientists have proven unequivocally that CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we release into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels act to trap heat and form an invisible blanket to warm the planet. Over the last century, the Earth's average temperature has continued to rise, with 9 of the 10 warmest years on record occurring since the year 2000. And true to form, 2015 was the Earth's warmest year on record. Rising global temperatures have led to extreme changes in weather events and in our environment. And no country is insulated, no state is insulated from the escalating effects of climate change. In the United States, we're seeing it in every region of the country, and we're witnessing its effects very dramatically in my state of New Hampshire. Rising temperatures are affecting our tourism, our outdoor recreation, and our agriculture industries. And we're experiencing an onset of negative health impacts and increases of insect-borne diseases. Lyme disease is one of those, all of which can be tied to the effects of climate change. Yet in the US and throughout the world, people acknowledge that global warming is an existential threat that requires immediate action to slow its pace and mitigate its effects, even while those climate deniers are still out there making noise. According to the Pew Research Center, 2/3 of all Americans acknowledge that climate change is real and that action must be taken to address it. But there are some, an extreme but influential minority, who argue that climate change is a hoax and that it lacks scientific consensus, that the changes we observe are not due to CO2s and other greenhouse gas emissions, but they're due instead to variations in the sun or cosmic rays, and that policies to limit greenhouse gas emissions will ruin our economy. Well, not surprisingly, these climate deniers are not scientists, though they may pretend to be. They are front groups funded by the fossil fuel industry generally, and the Koch brothers in particular. These front groups are paid to spin a web of denial wrapped in ideology with the aim of purposely deceiving the public about the dangers of climate change. This is deceitful and it's wrong. And we are here on the floor this afternoon to call out these groups by name so that the public knows what to watch for and there's some transparency about what's being said. Now, one of those groups is the Competitive Enterprise Institute, or CEI. It's based in Washington, D.C., and this group describes itself as, I quote, a public policy organization committed to advancing the principles of free enterprise and limited government. But if we look more closely, we find that CEI is not an independent organization. It is funded by powerful corporations designed to spread untruths and disinformation on behalf of its corporate sponsors. Now, in recent years, CEI has taken up the issue of climate change. It has been outspoken in disputing scientific evidence that human-produced greenhouse gas emissions are driving global warming. Now, some may recognize CEI not for their work on climate denial, but for its prominent role in misleading the public about the scientific evidence linking smoking to lung cancer and heart disease. Legal documents from major tobacco companies exposed the fact that CEI received more than $800,000 from Philip Morris to launch coordinated media campaigns to attack the Food and Drug Administration's efforts to regulate tobacco. And Mr. President, I have a series of these documents that pertain to CEI, and I would ask unanimous consent that they be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. CEI lobbied politicians, conducted symposia, and published policy papers and op-eds with titles such as, and I quote, "Safety is a relative thing for cars, why not for cigarettes?" CEI's then policy analyst, Alexander Volok, even went so far as to describe the act of smoking as a civic duty. CEI's missions, as the documents detail, the documents that we have just submitted for the record, their mission was to portray the FDA as an agency out of control and one failing to live up to its congressional mandate. And for a time, CEI was successful. Congress took a closer look at FDA's appropriations requests, and lawmakers slashed agency funding and passed language to restrict FDA's authority to regulate tobacco. In fact, at one oversight hearing, members of Congress even questioned whether the FDA was acting legally and responsibly in pursuing a course that would lead to tobacco regulation. Well, if this sounds like deja vu, that's because it is. CEI and other front groups are using the same playbook, the same tactics to deny climate change that they used to deny a link between tobacco use and fatal disease. CEI is now on a new mission to confuse and mislead the public on climate change. It is financing and directing ad hoc groups like the so-called Cooler Heads Coalition, which claims that global warming is a myth and that many scientists are skeptical of climate change. CEI has also produced 2 television ads that allege that the polar ice caps are thickening, not shrinking, and that CO2 emissions are good for the environment. Well, CEI's ads sound more like something that Saturday Night Live might come up with. For instance, their tagline about CO2 is, I quote, "They call it pollution, we call it life." Well, of course, we all know that CO2 is necessary for plant growth, but what that ad fails to mention is that too much CO2 in the atmosphere can cause global temperatures to rise, and that there is more of it in the atmosphere today than at any time during the last 420,000 years. So more carbon, more CO2s in the atmosphere than any time during the last 420,000 years. And just as in the case of big tobacco, one need only to look at who funds CEI to see how they determine their messaging. So we have a chart here to show where their funding comes from, and I would just point out that this is data that's all compiled from publicly available records. So we see from ExxonMobil Foundation, then we see the Koch family and their foundations, and then we see the Philip Morris companies. So significant funding from people who have an agenda about climate change. My staff has determined that between 1985 and 2015, CEI has received almost $15 million from right-wing organizations like the Donors Trust and the Dunn's Foundation for the Advancement of Right Thinking. And CEI has also received more than $2 million, as we see here, from ExxonMobil, and more than $1 million from the Koch foundations and the Koch brothers personally. And the strong ties between CEI's message denying climate change and the interests of coal, oil, and gas companies are clear and obvious. So it seems that while CEI has changed its client, it is still in the exact same business of selling lies, of selling out the health and the future of ordinary Americans. Now, another industry front group that I wanted to talk about this afternoon has been exceptionally loud in denying climate change. It is the so-called Energy and Environment Legal Institute, or E&E Legal. E&E Legal has several different aliases: the American Tradition Institute, George Mason Environmental Law Clinic, Free Market Environmental Law Clinic, but its MO is one and the same. Like CEI, E&E Legal has a core mission of discrediting climate science and dismantling regulations that protect the environment. However, instead of rolling out ad campaigns, E&E Legal has a different approach. Its specialty is harassing individual climate scientists and researchers with the aim of persuading the public that human-caused global warming is a scientific fraud. Of course, the group's lawsuits are frivolous and baseless, but this doesn't matter because the entire point of the lawsuits is to disrupt important academic research that may help us anticipate, avoid, or mitigate the impacts of global warming. And once again, if we look at the funding behind E&E Legal, we understand exactly why this group is attacking climate scientists and their work. E&E Legal does not publicly disclose its donors. We've seen that before. However, bankruptcy proceedings have identified that the group is funded by Arch Coal and Peabody Energy, and that E&E's senior lawyer has received funds directly from Alpha Natural Resources. These are some of the largest coal producers in the United States. So it's shameful and dishonorable that these coal companies are funding the harassment and intimidation of scientists. They are putting profits ahead of people, and their disinformation threatens the scientific inquiry and transparency we need in order to make smart climate policy decisions to protect our Earth. In conclusion, big corporations are using organizations that claim to be independent to spread misleading messages to the American people, knowing that the people would be quick to discount these messages if they actually knew they were coming directly from coal companies and from Koch Industries. This campaign of disinformation and propaganda endangers the health, environment, and economic well-being of people in the United States and across the world. And that's why senators who acknowledge the science of climate change, senators who understand the urgency of action to combat climate change, are speaking up this afternoon and for many days to come. By coming to the floor, we want to expose groups like CEI and E&E Legal for what they are, front groups whose role is to spin a web of denial. By championing clean energy policies, we want to ensure that the U.S. reduces its dependence on fossil fuels while creating millions of jobs to support our economy in alternative energy and green energy sources. By supporting our country's leadership in negotiating the International Climate Agreement concluded last year in Paris, we're doing our part to slow global warming and help poorer nations most affected by it. This is just the beginning. We will continue to come to the floor to advocate for policies to reduce carbon emissions, to strengthen our economy, and to protect our environment. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.